The night was still, but something in the air felt wrong. The child had been gone for hours, and the family had yet to speak a word. It was a silence that held more than just grief. There was a quiet horror in the air. In the distance, the faint sound of the earth shifting would be the first sign of something that no one could have predicted, something too unimaginable for most to even consider. But when the authorities arrived, the truth was uncovered in a way no one had prepared for. A child, barely 4 years old, buried alive by their own family. The unimaginable had happened in the most isolated of settings, where secrets are kept buried beneath layers of dirt, lies, and generations of silence. What would lead a family to commit such an atrocity? What kind of twisted belief, history, or event could turn human beings into perpetrators of something so dark? The whispers about the family had always been there. The town knew them for their reclusiveness, their strange ways, their disturbing silence about their past. But no one had ever suspected the depths of horror they could inflict. When the police began their investigation, they were unprepared for what they would uncover. Details too horrific for public consumption. A story that would never make the headlines but would haunt anyone who came into contact with it. Want to know the full story? Want to understand the real horrors hidden behind this unimaginable act? Make sure to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows for more deep dives into the darkest corners of true crime, mysteries, and unsolved cases. Let us take you further into the chilling details that no one else dares to uncover. Hit that bell icon to stay updated, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. The family at the center of this tragedy had long been considered an oddity by the small town. Nestled in a dilapidated farmhouse, far from prying eyes, the family lived in isolation. Their home, surrounded by overgrown fields and the forgotten remnants of old, rusted farm equipment, seemed to have its own air of melancholy, as though the house itself had witnessed untold horrors. The patriarch, Richard, had been the figurehead of the family for decades. A man whose reputation was built on secrecy and sternness, Richard never welcomed outsiders. He worked the land with a fierce determination, yet few had ever seen him smile or speak of anything outside of his daily duties. His wife, Evelyn, had been quiet and reserved, an ever-present shadow beside him. The two of them raised their children, 3 in total, in an environment where contact with the outside world was minimal and curiosity was met with suspicion. Their eldest child, Samuel, was known to be an eccentric young man with an unsettling demeanor. His behavior had always been off, with strange mannerisms and a tendency to speak in riddles, as if lost in a world of his own. His sisters, Sarah and Elizabeth, followed suit, rarely seen outside the confines of the farm. The family was shrouded in an aura of bizarre normalcy, with everyone in the town aware of them but few ever daring to get too close. Over the years, rumors about the family began to circulate, though they were always dismissed as nothing more than idle gossip. There were whispers of strange rituals, unexplained disappearances, and a belief that the family's bloodline was pure, an archaic belief passed down from generation to generation. The townspeople speculated that this belief in maintaining their bloodline could explain the family's odd behavior and tendencies, but no one dared confront them, fearing the wrath of Richard or the family's peculiar ways. No one realized the extent of their dark beliefs until it was too late. The seeds of tragedy had been sown quietly over the years, hidden behind the walls of the farmhouse, until one fateful moment when the family's twisted secret was uncovered, too horrific to ignore. It was a day like any other, with the scorching sun beating down on the quiet farmhouse. The air was thick with heat and dust, the kind of oppressive warmth that makes the world feel stagnant. But in the cramped living room of the house, there was no talk of the weather, no mention of the strange atmosphere that had settled over the family home. Instead, there was only the unsettling silence of a family who had long accepted their own twisted reality. The youngest child, Lily, had been playing outside, as she always did, in the fields behind the house. She loved running barefoot through the tall grass, chasing the stray animals that wandered onto the property. But that afternoon, something was different. Richard, the father, had been watching her from the window, his steely gaze following her every move. There was a coldness in his eyes, an emotionless expression that sent a chill down anyone who had the misfortune of crossing his path. As Lily giggled and twirled in the sun, she had no idea that she was being watched. The family had always kept to themselves, and though the town had whispered about them, no one had ever suspected the horrors they would eventually uncover. It wasn't until Lily ran into the house that the event began to unfold. Her father told her she needed to go to the basement and bring back a certain box. It was a simple task, but it was one that would mark the beginning of the end for the young girl. Lily hesitated, her young mind sensing something was wrong. But when her father's voice grew more commanding, she obeyed. As she descended the steps into the cold, dimly lit basement, she had no idea what awaited her. She had always feared the basement, with its damp smell and the eerie shadows that danced on the walls. But she never suspected that it would become the site of her own demise. Upstairs, Evelyn, the mother, stood motionless, her eyes staring at the floor. Samuel, the eldest child, had been quiet for the past several days, as he often was when his thoughts seemed to turn inward. Sarah and Elizabeth, the two middle children, watched from a distance, unsure of what was happening. None of them spoke as they knew that when Richard made a decision, it was final. It was then that the horrifying reality set in. Richard gave the order. The child had to be buried. His words were calm, matter-of-fact, as though the fate of Lily was nothing more than a simple task to be completed. The family, having lived in their twisted world of isolation for so long, had become numb to what they were about to do. The horror of what happened next was not only the physical act of burying their own flesh and blood, but the complete lack of remorse, the chilling indifference with which they carried out the deed. It wasn't the first time the family had buried someone alive, and tragically, it wouldn't be the last. The terrifying reality of the family's dark beliefs, maintaining their bloodline and purging any perceived weakness from it, had been taken to an unfathomable extreme. By the time the authorities arrived, the earth had already settled over Lily's fragile body, and as they dug up the grave, the horror that was unearthed would change the town forever. But even more so, it would change the lives of those who discovered the truth. The discovery of the child's body sent shockwaves through the small, tight-knit community. It wasn't just the barbarity of the crime, but the realization that it had occurred under their noses, in a place that had been so familiar, yet so deeply hidden in its own secrets. The authorities were slow to respond, initially unsure of how to handle the situation or what exactly they were dealing with. It wasn't until a neighbor, a local woman named Beth, reported seeing strange activity around the house that the investigation began in earnest. Beth had always been one of the few people brave enough to venture near the farmhouse. Her curiosity, mixed with concern for the odd family, led her to witness something that had been kept out of sight for far too long. A sudden increase in the family's isolation and the muffled cries she heard coming from the house during the night were just the beginning. When she saw the family gathering in the yard late one evening, standing in a circle around something, or someone, she knew something was wrong. She called the local sheriff, a man named Daniel Hoff, who had known the family for years. The sheriff, despite his suspicions of the family's strange behavior, never imagined he would be called to investigate such an atrocity. Still, duty called, and he arrived at the farmhouse with his deputies in tow, ready to get answers. As they approached the farmhouse, the sight of the place filled them with an unease that only grew stronger as they drew closer. The once vibrant fields were now overrun with weeds. The house itself looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The only sign of life was the family, standing in the doorway, waiting for them. Richard, the father, stood tall, his eyes cold and unwavering, but there was a certain tension in his posture. Evelyn, his wife, stared silently, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The children were nowhere to be seen. Sheriff Hoff didn't waste time with pleasantries. He demanded to speak with the family. But Richard's stoic demeanor and Evelyn's silence made it clear that they were hiding something. After some back and forth, Sheriff Hoff requested permission to search the premises. Richard begrudgingly agreed, his voice low and clipped, as though he were doing them a favor. The search began, and it didn't take long for them to find the truth. The basement door was locked, but with a simple turn of the key, they gained entry. The cold, musty air of the basement hit them immediately. The walls were lined with old wooden crates and rusted tools. But as they moved deeper into the room, their eyes were drawn to the corner where something was buried beneath a thin layer of dirt. It was there that they uncovered the small, lifeless body of Lily, her frail form partially hidden under the earth. Her tiny hands were clenched tightly as though in an attempt to protect herself from the unimaginable fate she had suffered. The sheriff's heart sank as he realized the horror that had taken place within these walls. His gut told him that this wasn't just a simple case of neglect. It was much darker. With trembling hands, he signaled for his deputies to take the body for forensic examination, while he turned to face the family, who stood in the doorway, still silent. Richard's gaze was cold, but there was a flicker of something else behind his eyes, something far more dangerous. Word of the discovery spread quickly. The town was in disbelief, struggling to comprehend how such a brutal act could have occurred in their own backyard. The sheriff knew that what had been uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation continued, the horrors of the family's twisted beliefs and the lengths they had gone to protect their secrets began to unravel. And with each new revelation, it became clear that this was no isolated incident. The discovery of Lily's body was just the beginning of a much darker revelation. As the investigation into the family's history deepened, it became clear that this was not just an isolated crime. It was a symptom of a much deeper, more sinister psychological and social issue. The family's behavior, their beliefs, and their isolation were all pieces of a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture of their mindset. Richard, the patriarch, was a man of rigid principles and absolute control. His cold, calculating nature had always been evident, but what the investigators uncovered about his past was even more chilling. It became apparent that he had grown up in a family with similar beliefs, beliefs that valued purity above all else. In his mind, maintaining a pure bloodline was not just important. It was essential for survival. His harsh, authoritarian rule over his family was not born out of love, but from a warped sense of duty to uphold a belief system that had been passed down through generations. Evelyn, the mother, was a woman who had once shown warmth and kindness, but over the years, that warmth had eroded under the weight of her husband's influence. She was emotionally dependent on Richard, and her compliance with his decisions, no matter how horrific, was rooted in fear. Her silence during the investigation spoke volumes. She knew what had happened, and yet, there was no visible sign of remorse. It was as if the family's deep-seated beliefs had suffocated any sense of guilt or empathy. Evelyn had been so consumed by the family's collective mentality that she had ceased to see the child as an individual, but as a part of a much larger, horrifying plan. The children, though still young, had also been deeply affected by the family's isolation and strange practices. Samuel, the eldest son, had always been eccentric, but as the investigation revealed, his eccentricities went beyond mere oddities. He had been the most vocal of the children in supporting his father's beliefs, echoing Richard's values of purity and strength. Samuel's behavior, marked by bouts of delusional thinking, reflected the mental toll that growing up in such an environment had on him. He had been conditioned to see the world in black and white terms, where anyone who didn't fit into the mold was disposable. Sarah and Elizabeth, the two middle children, had grown up in the same environment, but their reactions were different. While they were more reserved and less vocal, the investigation uncovered that they, too, had internalized the family's twisted values. They saw themselves as part of something bigger, something more significant, and their role in the family's insular world was unquestioned. They had been taught to believe that loyalty to the family came before all else, and this sense of loyalty had blinded them to the fact that they were living within a broken system. The family's social isolation was a significant factor in their warped worldview. For years, they had been cut off from the rest of society, their interactions with the outside world limited to brief, often hostile encounters. This isolation had allowed Richard and Evelyn to mold their children's minds without outside influence, fostering an environment where their beliefs were unquestioned. The family had become a closed ecosystem, where any dissent or outside perspective was not only unwelcome but actively suppressed. The community, when they learned of the family's dark secret, was shaken to its core. The revelation that such horrors had been hidden in plain sight for so long left many grappling with their own culpability. How had no one seen the signs? How had the family's isolation gone unnoticed for so long? The emotional and psychological toll on the townspeople was significant, as many felt guilty for never having intervened, for never having asked the right questions. But the impact on the family was even more profound. As the investigation progressed, the members of the family were slowly peeled apart, their tightly knit bonds unraveling under the weight of their crimes. Richard, once the unquestioned authority, now faced the harsh reality that his twisted beliefs had not only led to his downfall but had destroyed the very family he sought to protect. Evelyn, too, was forced to confront the consequences of her silence, while Samuel, Sarah, and Elizabeth were left to reckon with the damage they had helped to perpetuate. For the first time in their lives, the family was forced to confront the horrifying truth of what they had done, and the heavy price they would now pay. The shocking tragedy that unfolded within the confines of the isolated farmhouse was not an isolated event. It was part of a much larger and deeply ingrained cultural and societal issue that, while extreme, was not as rare as one might think. Inbreeding, isolation, and the perpetuation of harmful beliefs often go hand in communities that remain cut off from the outside world. The family at the center of this horror was a product of such a society, one where the danger of cultural insularity and the unchecked transmission of harmful traditions created an environment ripe for abuse. In many isolated communities, there exists a strong sense of familial loyalty and pride that can easily become distorted. While these values are not inherently harmful, when they become extreme, they can foster environments where deviations from tradition are not tolerated, and those who fail to conform to the family's expectations are seen as expendable. In this case, the family's strict belief in maintaining the purity of their bloodline, handed down through generations, led them to embrace practices that bordered on the horrifying. Cultural isolation breeds fear of the outside world, fear of change, fear of the unknown, and, most dangerously, fear of questioning the status quo. Communities like the one in which this family lived often operate in a vacuum, shielded from the advances of modern society. They are entrenched in old ways of thinking that can lead to the perpetuation of harmful traditions and beliefs. In such environments, any challenge to the status quo is met with resistance, and even the smallest deviation is viewed with suspicion or hostility. Over time, these attitudes can become institutionalized, embedded into the very fabric of the community. In the case of Richard and his family, this insular worldview shaped their perception of right and wrong, molding their behavior into something truly grotesque. Their belief that their bloodline was sacred, that their family was superior to others, created a mindset where they saw no problem with their extreme actions. To them, the death of their child was justified by their twisted logic. The purity of their family needed to be preserved at all costs, even if that meant sacrificing one of their own. This perverse sense of duty to their bloodline made it easier for them to rationalize the unthinkable. But the societal impact of inbreeding goes beyond the actions of this particular family. Communities that practice isolation and inbreeding often face severe psychological and social consequences. Inbreeding, whether due to ignorance or deliberate choice, can lead to a host of genetic disorders, mental health issues, and physical deformities. These issues often go unaddressed in communities where education and medical care are limited, further compounding the cycle of harm. The effects are not only felt by the immediate family but by the larger community as well, as these individuals are often left to fend for themselves, without the support or resources needed to address their issues. Socially, these communities tend to become self-sustaining microcosms, where everyone knows everyone else's business, but where outsiders are seen as a threat. This insularity fosters an environment where any act of violence, no matter how horrific, is kept behind closed doors, shielded from the prying eyes of the outside world. The family at the center of this story had lived in such a bubble, where their secrets were carefully guarded, and the larger community had been unable to intervene. The silence surrounding their actions allowed the family to perpetuate their beliefs and practices without fear of repercussion. Culturally, this tragedy highlights the dangers of unchecked tradition, the need for community intervention, and the importance of breaking the cycle of harmful practices. It serves as a stark reminder that when individuals are left to operate in isolation, their actions can become far more dangerous than they might ever be in a larger, more connected society. The family's downfall was a result of their inability to adapt to the changing world around them and their refusal to accept the fact that their beliefs were not only outdated but deadly. The tragic story of the family who buried their child alive is a chilling reminder of the dangers of isolation, twisted belief systems, and the dark consequences of unchecked traditions. As the investigation revealed, the family's descent into horror was not an isolated event, but rather the culmination of years of psychological manipulation, cultural insularity, and deep-seated fears passed down from generation to generation. What began as a secluded existence, shielded from the outside world, turned into a nightmare that shocked the town and left everyone questioning how such a monstrous act could happen in plain sight. At the heart of this tragedy lies the family's distorted perception of loyalty, purity, and survival. Richard, the father, believed that maintaining the purity of their bloodline was paramount, even if it meant the loss of an innocent life. His actions were motivated by an irrational sense of duty to his family's twisted legacy, where any weakness, any deviation from the rigid structure they had created, was seen as a threat. Evelyn, his wife, stood by silently, complicit in the crime, while their children were raised to accept these warped beliefs without question. The result was a devastating act that no one outside the family could have ever imagined. But the story doesn't end with the unearthing of Lily's body. It serves as a grim warning about the consequences of cultural isolation and the dangers of living in a bubble where harmful practices are allowed to fester. Communities that remain cut off from the world, where fear and secrecy dominate, create fertile ground for such tragedies to occur. Without the external influences of progress, education, and empathy, families like this can continue to live in denial, unable to recognize the damage they're inflicting on their own children and the society around them. The impact of this story goes beyond the family itself. It forces us to confront the dark side of human nature, the capacity for cruelty born from ignorance and fear. It challenges us to ask difficult questions. How can we prevent such horrors from happening again? How can we intervene before a tragedy unfolds? The answers are complex, but one thing is clear. We must work together as a society to ensure that no one is left to live in isolation, that no child is subjected to such horrors, and that no belief system is allowed to justify the unthinkable. Ultimately, the story of this family is a tragic reminder of the importance of community, compassion, and the shared responsibility we all have to protect the most vulnerable among us. It is only through awareness, understanding, and action that we can hope to prevent such horrors from happening in the future.